The Federal and Velavan Hypermarket jointly present the Thoothukudi Marathon 2024 to raise awareness on drug abuse. Associate sponsors, the Vikasa School, SA Rehabilitation Center, DCW Limited, and Tamil Restaurant.
So thank you very much for joining us, Commodore Uday Bhaskar. Great to have you there on the Federal. I would like to begin by asking you on the lessons learned in Kargil. It's been 25 years of Operation Vijay. Has been an absolute display of courage and valor of Indian Armed Forces. How do you see it?
Kargil at 25 is a very important punctuation as far as the country's security experience is concerned. If I were to place this in a larger historical context, we look at India in 1947, when India became independent. The first challenge to territorial integrity came up in October of that year, within 3 months literally. This is something that perhaps the younger generation may not quite be aware of. But India's territorial integrity was challenged as early as October 1947. And in many ways, that challenge has not completely gone. And Kargil, when it took place in 1999, May of 1999, was in many ways a replay of the same challenge to India's territorial integrity, particularly in relation to Jammu and Kashmir. So now when we look back at Kargil in 2024, which is, as I said, Kargil at 25, I think there are a number of important strands that need to be highlighted. I have my own reservations about lessons learned, and I think that is, of course, greater the pity and the larger challenge for the country. But the single most, I think, magnificent, splendid strand, if I could put it that way, was the valor of the Indian soldier, the young officer, the young soldiers, the way in which they retrieved a very, very difficult situation for India is unprecedented in the annals of recent history. Because if you look at the topography of the Kargil sector and the different battles that took place, whether it is Tiger Hill, Tololing, Batalik, now I think at least because of television and cyber, people know about the Kargil topography, location, and the wars. So I think this stands out and it should be applauded, it should be saluted, and we should pay reverential homage to those who lost their lives and the families who are now still coping with that loss, and the many veterans who were very grievously injured. So I think the human dimension is something that shines. But that having been said, I think there are other aspects of that war which are not so flattering. And I think they also need to be brought on board. And here I think there are two dimensions which I'd like to dwell upon briefly. One is what led to Kargil. It was an intelligence lapse. That is the broad received wisdom of the subject. So I think the question to me as an analyst is, has India learned the right lessons to redress these intelligence lapses so that we do not have a similar challenge? And to me, the answer is slightly bleak. It's in the negative, meaning that India was surprised in 1999, Kargil happened. India was surprised in 2022 when Galwan happened. You remember Galwan, what happened with China. Conceptually, in a systemic sense, it is the same issue, an intelligence inadequacy. So to me, that is, I think, an important kind of parameter of the lessons of Kargil. That the Indian system, particularly the higher defense management apparatus of this country, which starts with the Prime Minister, the Cabinet Committee on Security, and then you come down, have not been able to look at the intelligence domain in the way they should. And here there is a additional kind of what I would call element of Kargil, which is very distinctive and again to be applauded. I should have mentioned it earlier. Kargil war took place in May 1999. We arrived at closure in the end of July. July 26th marks the official end of the Kargil war, which is why we have Vijay Divas. I also have some problems with the word Vijay because, it was not much of a victory. It was retrieving a very difficult situation. It was definitely the triumph of the Indian soldier. But for the Indian state, I would call it as pulling back from a very, very difficult operational tactical situation in that part of J&K. And what was remarkable is that Prime Minister Vajpayee, to his credit, set up a committee called the Kargil Review Committee. It was headed by the doyen of India's strategic studies, the late Mr. K. Subramanian, who again, for those who may not be aware, is the father of our current foreign minister, Dr. Jaishankar. So K. Sub, as he was called, the former IAS officer, director of the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, where I spent a lot of time. He was the chairman of that committee. It had two other members, General Hazari, Lieutenant General Hazari, a former vice chief of the army, and the celebrated journalist, Mr. George Varghese. So they were the members of this committee, and there was a very, very distinguished diplomat, Mr. Satish Chandra, who was the member secretary, if I remember right. And they produced this report within 6 months of the setting up of the Kargil Review Committee. It was tabled in Parliament, and to Mr. Vajpayee's credit, he allowed most of the Kargil Review Committee to be published or put in the public domain. It appeared in the form of a book. It's called the KRC report, Kargil Review Committee report. It was published as a book, and it was a very important, I would say, addition to India's security literature, because for the first time, we had a comprehensive account by a 3-member committee. And they had some very, I would say, thoughtful findings. And the title of that book is very interesting. It says, From Surprise to Reckoning. So they don't use the word victory. India had to reckon with the gravity of that challenge. And the Indian Army, the Indian Air Force, the Indian Navy, the Indian military, the entire apparatus was able to make that very valiant effort and retrieve a very difficult situation for India at that time in terms of the threat and challenge to territorial integrity. And the last point, Vijay, if I could add, is that in the Kargil Review Committee report, there is a large section that talks about the intelligence lapses and the fact that there was absolutely no sharing and there was no assessment the way it ought to be. I mean, it's a large, I would say, kind of observation about the intelligence lapses. And when this happened in 1999, various recommendations were made. And that is the disappointing part, that 25 years later, we find that there's hardly any national policy to redress, reform, and carry out the kind of rewiring that India's intelligence structures need, which is why I personally maintain that because we didn't learn the right lessons of Kargil, Galwan happened. And at a lower level, in terms of the entire intelligence, I would say, texture of intelligence competence, even today we are dealing with problems in Jammu. You know, whether we talk about Doda or other things that happened in June, July, are often said, you know, there was insufficient intelligence or inadequate intelligence or the assessment was below par, etc., etc. So this problem is only going to get more acute as I see it, which is why I was talking about October 1947. And next year, we're going to be talking about India at 75. 1950 is the Indian Republic. So that is the sad part, that we will still be dealing with these challenges to territorial.
Commodore, since you touched upon the topic of, intelligence failure there, I want to ask you, India has been engaging in several multilateral forums at this point of time, Quad, and, we've got great relations with the West. Do you think any kind of intelligence failure in the coming years, is almost impossible or, in fact, unpardonable there?
No, I would frame it in the following way, Vijay, which is that intelligence is a complex domain. Technology has made it even more complex. Today, the kind of tools you have for surveillance have made intelligence gathering, intelligence assessment, and now the introduction of AI, artificial intelligence, is also going to add to the complexity. So if one were to use a term from thermodynamics, there's something called entropy.
Okay.
And I think those who are familiar with the sciences will know what it means, which is the complexity and the pace at which changes are taking place is only going to increase. It's going to become more animated. It's going to become more complex, more, I would say, dense. There are various ways of looking at this. So India needs to acquire the competence at a national level Because today intelligence is not only about the military. It's not only about the agency, the IB and the RAW. It's not only about, say, one sector of the government. It's composite. It's national intelligence. And that is the kind of competence we need to acquire. And I don't get a sense that we are doing it, because if we were, it would be evident. And I think that's the biggest takeaway to me from Kargil, that we have not yet learned the right lessons. And let me add this, Vijay, if I may, since I spoke about two strands, intelligence and military. In as much as we celebrate the valor of the Indian soldier and the young Indian soldier, in retrospect, I say this a little reluctantly, that now it is becoming more and more evident that the generalship, at the top level, was perhaps not at the required levels, because those are the kind of findings that are now being, every year we have some new kind of understanding of the war. Unfortunately, and this is another part of this whole Kargil thing that you might want to hoist. India is not very good at publishing official records of its own wars or making the necessary disclosures, which is very important for a democracy. We had the war with China in October 1962. There was something called a Henderson-Brooks report, which was commissioned immediately after that war. It was supposed to look at the military aspect. It was by a totally military general of the Indian Army at that time. And unfortunately, from 1962 to 2024, successive governments, despite saying something else when they were in opposition, have not allowed this particular report to be in the public domain, though, of course, most of it is already there in a pirated form, etc. But that's not the point. India should take ownership of its lapses at a national level. If you had placed that confidently in Parliament and said this needs to be discussed, these are the things that went wrong, maybe it would have led to a different kind of, shall we say, set of policies. Mind you, not that not placing the Henderson-Brooks report made such a big difference, because October 1962 was followed by December 1971 with the birth of Bangladesh. I mean, that was an extraordinary military victory for India. But in the case of Kargil, even now, we do not have the official history in the public domain. There was some hesitation, reticence about how much documentation could be given to the historians who were looking at the project. And as a result, most of our understanding is based on personal accounts, biographies, military leaders at that time who wrote about it. For instance, the Army Chief General Ved Malik, he has a book, From Surprise to Victory. That is his book. Then we have personal accounts of the Air Chief at that time, Air Chief Marshal Tipnis. We have an account by the Naval Chief, Admiral Sushil Kumar, who was also the chairman of the Chiefs of Staff. And like that, there are other officers who've written, there are historians who've written, there are military historians who have written on the subject. But we don't have an official version, and that, I think, is a lacuna. Again, unfortunately, and I say this with some regret and sadness, that General Nirmal Vich, who was the Director General of Military Operations during that war, he had authored a book which was supposed to be released this week, in this 25th anniversary of Vijay Divas. But from media reports, one understands that that book has been put on hold, because some of the newspapers reported the excerpt that he had spoken about intelligence lapses and made reference to the R&AW, which is the research and analysis wing. Now, it's unfortunate, because I think these are the kind of things that should be discussed in public, as you and I are discussing now. If there was an intelligence lapse, I think it is fair to ask, how did it happen? Which were the institutions that were responsible for this? And so on and so forth. But unfortunately, this kind of a healthy debate has not been allowed. Now, as a result, there's a lot of speculation. Now, I have attended conferences and seminars over the last month in and around Delhi, where you have a completely opposite view from people who are in the intelligence business. The retired community there, they say that no, the inputs were given to the army, but they sauced it up. They were not able to deal with it. Now, that is the kind of thing which I think is undesirable in terms of speculation. We should have a more informed debate. Similarly, there are aspersions being cast on the army leadership. You may be aware that there's a retired major who has filed a charge against, who has initiated a legal process against the former Army Chief General Ved Malik for some statements that General Malik had made. These are casting aspersions. That is what I'm saying is undesirable. And therefore, a candid kind of debate. Now, there was another, now since we're talking about the military, let me add this. I read a report recently which said that our understanding and interpretation and narrative of the war is also perhaps skewed. The specific references that if you look at the various sectors, Kargil and Dras have got a lot of highlighting, people are talking about it. But I gather the Batalic sector, which was being the responsibility at that time of 70 Infantry Brigade, had not received adequate notice then and even now. And one retired officer made a very important observation about 70 Infantry Brigade. And this, I think, those who are familiar with the military and the army would appreciate. Apparently, at the height of the operations, 70 Infantry Brigade, being led by the commander, Brigadier Devinder Singh, a distinguished soldier, had 11 battalions. Normally a brigade has 3 battalions. A division has 9 battalions. Here you had 70 Infantry Brigade, ostensibly a reserve brigade at that time, carrying out its operations with 11 battalions. And at the end of the war, the brigade commander, so I gather, Brigadier Devinder Singh, does not get a gallantry award, while his citation reads like that of a gallantry, like a Veer Chakra, Mahavir Chakra, whatever. He gets a VSM, which is a good service medal. Even I have a VSM, but I got it for good service. So that is the kind of anomaly that I think needs to be looked at in a more objective way. And I am hoping that Kargil at 25 would spur or encourage the government and all the domain experts to look at this war in a more reflective and objective way, so that we do not have a repeat of Kargil at any time. That we should not sacrifice the lives of our young soldiers because of inadequacies in the system at higher levels, at different parts of the lattice. That is my observation.
It was Kargil experts say that kicked off the dehyphenation between India and Pakistan on the world stage. So India is currently seen as a counterweight to China. And how do you see India has progressed over the years? It's been 25 years of Kargil. How do you see India has progressed over the years in terms of strategy, in terms of diplomacy?
Well, again, I should have mentioned this because one of the most distinctive features, I think Kargil could be framed as a war with many distinctive and many anomalous features. The distinctive feature is that in May 1998, India and Pakistan declared their nuclear weapon capability. May 98.
Yeah.
Then we had the Lahore Accord of early 99, when Mr. Vajpayee as Prime Minister goes to Pakistan, signed the Lahore Accord with Mr. Nawaz Sharif as Prime Minister, General Musharraf is the army chief, and then in a very stealthy and audacious operation, General Musharraf launches the Kargil operation. The distinctive feature is that in less than a year of 2 proximate neighbors who are both nuclear, they engage in a border war or over a piece of territory. That is unprecedented. In the Cold War, post-Cold War, there is no such situation where 2 neighbors are engaged in military hostilities over territorial issues. And Kargil is an example of that. And full marks to Prime Minister Vajpayee at that time. And I would say even to Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, though he accepted defeat and withdrew, that the nuclear issue, though there was some nuclear saber rattling by Pakistan and Pakistan's military, it was kept well below that, and it was a limited war in that sense. So that was the most distinctive feature. And the dehyphenation that you spoke about, Vijay, I would say it is very important because after the Kargil war and India's way in which India conducted itself and the restraint and what I would call as the political kind of sagacity of Mr. Vajpayee, the dehyphenation began in a very definitive way. It was Mr. Clinton who was the president at that time. He made a number of observations. And after the Kargil war was over in July 1999, in March of 2000, we have Mr. Bill Clinton in India addressing the Joint Parliament in Delhi. And he is very, very positive about India and its own profile. And he has very disparaging and negative terms for Pakistan and its role in creating the kind of disruption and nuclear-enabled terrorism that it engages in. So these are some of the elements which are the fallout of the Kargil war, which I would say definitely enhanced, burnished India's profile. And I think that is the, again, characteristic that we should now reflect upon, that India was able to turn around a very difficult situation. Politically, let's not forget that Mr. Vajpayee was a caretaker prime minister. If you remember, in April of 1999, he had lost the vote of confidence by 1 vote. I mean, this was the first ND led by Mr. Vajpayee of the BJP. And these were the kind of democratic norms that India was very, very strictly adhering to, which enhanced India's credibility. But it was a very anomalous situation that a major democracy goes to war with a caretaker prime minister. But to his credit, Mr. Vajpayee had the full opposition, briefed about what he was doing, and therefore there was a political kind of unity. Militarily, as I said, it was 2 proximate neighbors who had acquired nuclear weapons who were dealing with a territorial issue. And as far as I think the media is concerned, which is also an important aspect, this was the first televised war, as they call it. This is the first time that Indian media was reporting from the front, very unlike what happened in 1962 or 65 and 71. And that, of course, was because of technology. I mean, we only had radio, if you remember, in the 1971 war, whereas 1962 was a complete black hole. There was nothing coming out from the front because of technology constraints. So Kargil had many anomalous and many distinctive features. And clearly, the dehyphenation that you talk about and India's own, I would say, emergence in the regional context, just as it emerged in a very positive way after 71. Similarly, Kargil enabled India to be acknowledged on the global stage. And as I said, after March 2000, the Bill Clinton visit, very soon India is in a position to negotiate with the United States for the civilian nuclear agreement, which is 2005. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh is in the chair. And that is the beginning of what I would call as an increasing kind of distinction between what is Pakistan and what is India, and India's own profile both in the region and in the global arena. Yeah.
India's defense spending in the most recent union budget has come down, and as the government wants to keep the spotlight on employment there. So, the critics have said that the defense spending is quite marginal when compared to its neighbors like China and Pakistan. You've got a bigger enemy to tackle right now. So do you think, what's your say on the India's a defense spending there? Well, in spite of all the Atmanirbhar Bharat initiatives, there's promise to create a robust defense ecosystem in India.
My consistent observation for the last 20 odd years is that India needs to allocate more resources for its defense. What we are currently spending is inadequate. The suggestion that the Indian defense budget has to be reduced because we need to create more jobs, I think is an invalid formulation. India needs to create more jobs. That is a completely different challenge, which I think has to be addressed. It's a serious challenge. But I think it's poor fiscal management at the national level to suggest that this can be done by cutting down the defense budget, or for that matter, cutting down defense pensions. After you see what happened in Kargil, to say that we can have a scheme which would reduce the pension burden because we do not have enough funds, to me, again, is anomalous. I don't think that's a valid argument. But unfortunately, we are in a situation where India has a number of serious fiscal constraints, and I'm the first to acknowledge that a rising pension bill poses its own challenges at a national level. Whether you're a civilian employee or you're from the military, I think a rising pension bill, and given the demographic changes and the employment patterns that are taking place, it has to be addressed. But if we limit our current discussion to the defense budget, we are spending under 2.5%. It's 2.2 last count that I can remember of India's total expenditure for defense, and that's a very modest amount. Within this, the so-called capital expenditure, which we use for modernizing the armed forces, is shrinking because the rupee is weakening in the global market against the US dollar year on year. If you see what is the value of the rupee, say on January 1st or April 1st, depending on which year you want, calendar or finance, you find that the rupee is weakening against the dollar. So for the same amount of rupees, you are getting lesser dollars to buy in the international market. Concurrently, your ability to produce the kind of equipment you need within the country has also been below par. So all these cumulatively lead to a situation where the competence of the fighting machine is getting diluted. That is not a desirable result. Whether it is the gun or the man behind the gun, or now even the woman behind the gun, the soldier behind the gun, both of them have to be nurtured. Both of them have to be honed. in a way that they are appropriate for combat. We don't want this Kargil situation where General Manik had said at that time, we will fight with what we have. I mean, we were scrambling to get ammunition. Indian officials were going all over the world, trying to get ammunition and other spares and surveillance equipment at short notice. We don't want to be in that situation. For that, we have to allocate more resources. And I think this is a national challenge which should be debated in Parliament. But again, regrettably, we hardly have any debate worth a mention in Parliament on matters pertaining to national security. That's another very big omission.
Okay. So one last question there, and on the Agnipath scheme, which is sort of brought a lot of controversy in northern India, particularly there. So the government says, look, it's the best meaner, leaner, and a scheme to upgrade the Indian Army and so on. What's your take on that?
Well, my take, again, I've said this in the past, I'm saying it again. I think all the available information we have about the scheme seems to suggest that it was hastily implemented.
Mm-hmm.
To look at the way in which it was applied across all three armed forces, Army, Navy, and Air Force. There are references in the yet-to-be-published book of the former Army Chief General Narwane. There are other observations that have been made. One of the retired chiefs, the Naval Chief Admiral KB Singh, had made a statement on social media. I think if you put all these together, I think the consensus is that this could have been tried out as a pilot on a much smaller scale. But again, I think as retired people, one has to be a little cautious because we don't really know what is happening within the system. And there are, I would say, wiser and more competent people within the system. The first cycle of 4 years is not yet over. So I think we should all wait for the assessment to come in by those who are in the driver's seat just now. But on the face of it, I can definitely talk about the Navy and perhaps to an extent the Air Force. The kind of training you need, for instance, in the Indian Navy, at least, we have a branch called the artificer. We have artificers who are in the engine room. We have artificers in the electrical branch who deal with the weapons and the radars and the surveillance and so on. So this particular category of the artificer takes anything between 5 to 7 years for full training, where you can hand over a piece of equipment to the artificer, whether he's an EAP-4 or an EAP-3, as the case may be, which is the equivalent of a petty officer or a chief petty officer. And if you take 7 years to train a person, you hope that you will be able to retain the service of that person for another 5 to 7 years, which is what the current pattern is. That at the end of 15 years, that particular sailor who's trained, who has delivered, who's given to the system, can then make a choice to either go or stay on the service. I think to have a 4-year scheme, particularly for a service like the Navy, which has kind of high tech, and the same, by the way, applies to the Air Force and even the Army, which is dealing with a lot of high tech in their vertical technical verticals, would definitely, I think, not lend itself to a 4-year cycle. So my sense is that this particular scheme would have to be reviewed objectively, and let us not politicize it. That will be unfortunate that if the government of India or the government of the day decides to make revisions because of pressure from Bihar, because the JDU has said something or because the Samajwadi Party has said something, and that I think is perhaps not the best way of framing the solution to what seems to be an emerging kind of challenge when we talk about the overall combat capacity of the Indian military. This combat capacity index for the military should be the primary concern. That if I make a major policy change, say Agnipath, the question that to me as an observer, as an outsider, as a citizen of India, as someone who looks at defense matters, as an analyst, as a student, would be that if you embark on a major policy change, do you move the needle? And do you move the needle in the positive direction in enhancing that combat efficiency of the military? So far, the answer is not very persuasive that it is moving in the right direction.
Thank you very much, Commodore Uday Bhaskar, for joining us on the Federal. That was fascinating talking to you, sir. Thank you very much.
The Federal and Velavan Hypermarket jointly present the Thoothukudi Marathon 2024 to raise awareness on drug abuse. Associate sponsors, the Vikasa School, SA Rehabilitation Center, DCW Limited, and Tamil Restaurant.